I didn't know the man watching me had already decided I wasn't leaving that building alone. The rain hit like gravel against the glass, loud enough to drown out my thoughts, sharp enough to make every step feel urgent, and by the time my sneakers slipped on the marble floor of the lobby, I was already soaked through, my hoodie clinging to my skin, my breath uneven from running 3 blocks in a storm that seemed determined to swallow the city whole. I shouldn't have been there. The building wasn't on any campus map, wasn't a place students wandered into by accident, but the wind had picked up so suddenly, snapping umbrellas inside out, sending trash cans rolling across the street, and when I saw the unlocked door, glowing like a safe haven in the dark, I didn't think. I just moved. Inside, everything felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain at first. Too quiet, too clean, like the air itself was watching me, and I told myself it was just nerves, just the leftover adrenaline from the storm, as I pressed the elevator button with shaking fingers. The numbers lit up one by one, slow, deliberate, like the building had all the time in the world, unlike me, and when the doors opened, I stepped in without checking the directory, without asking questions, just needing somewhere dry, somewhere still. The hallway on the top floor was dim, lined with dark wood and soft lights that barely touched the floor, and I picked the first door that wasn't locked, slipping inside as another crack of thunder shook the windows behind me. The office was bigger than my entire apartment, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city, leather chairs, a desk that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and I stood there for a second, dripping water onto polished floors, trying to convince myself this was normal, that I'd just wait out the storm and leave before anyone noticed. But something felt off. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, intentional, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be found. I moved toward the window, wiping condensation from the glass with the sleeve of my hoodie, watching headlights blur into streaks below, my heartbeat slowly settling, until I heard it. A click. Soft. Precise. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to accidents. I turned too fast, my pulse spiking again, eyes scanning the room. But nothing had changed, nothing except the feeling, stronger now, pressing against my chest, telling me I wasn't alone. You picked the wrong place to hide. The voice came from behind me, calm, controlled, close enough to make my breath catch, and I froze before I even turned, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet didn't move. Slowly, I faced him. He stood near the door like he had always been there, tall, composed, dressed in a way that made the entire room feel like it belonged to him, like everything did. Dark hair, sharp features, eyes that didn't just look at me, but through me, measuring, calculating, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just his office, this was his world. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, my hands tightening at my sides as I tried to look anywhere but directly at him. The storm. I just needed somewhere to wait. He didn't answer right away. He studied me instead, like I was something unexpected, something that didn't fit, and somehow that felt worse than anger. The door downstairs was unlocked. I added quickly, like that would explain anything, like it would make this normal, make him nod and tell me to leave. He took a step closer instead. Not rushed, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance in a way that made my chest tighten. "Nothing here is unlocked by accident," he said quietly, and the way he said it made the room feel smaller, like the walls had shifted while I wasn't looking. My throat went dry. "Then I'll go," I said, turning slightly toward the door, but before I could take a step, his voice stopped me again. No, one word. Calm. Final. It didn't echo, didn't need to. It landed exactly where it was meant to. I looked back at him, confusion mixing with something colder, something sharper, because there was no anger in his expression, no frustration, just a kind of certainty that made my skin prickle. "You walked in," he said, his gaze steady, unblinking. "During the 1 hour this building shuts itself to the outside world." My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" I asked, even though part of me didn't want to know. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "It means," he said, taking another step closer, his voice lowering just enough to make it feel like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. "You're not leaving until I decide you can." And for the first time since I stepped inside, the storm outside didn't feel like the worst thing I had run into. I should have argued. I should have laughed it off, called him out for being dramatic, done anything that made this feel normal. But the way he stood there, completely still, completely certain, stripped every option down to silence. My fingers curled slightly at my sides, cold from the rain, and I became painfully aware of every detail. The faint hum of something hidden in the walls, the soft glow of the city beyond the glass, the distance between me and the door that suddenly felt much farther than it should have been. "You cannot keep me here," I said, forcing the words out even though they felt thin, fragile compared to the weight in his voice. And for a moment I thought he might smile, not because it was funny, but because he had expected that exact response. "I am not keeping you," he replied evenly, tilting his head just slightly as if studying a problem he had already solved. "I am observing what you do next." The answer made no sense, and somehow that made it worse. I took a step toward the door anyway, testing the space between us, waiting to see if he would move to block me, but he did not. He simply watched. Always watching. My hand reached the handle. Cold metal. Solid. I turned it. Nothing. It did not move. I tried again, harder this time, the quiet click of resistance echoing louder than it should have, and a strange heat crept up the back of my neck. "It locks automatically," he said, not as a warning, not even as an explanation, just a statement, like gravity or time. I turned back slowly, my pulse picking up again, frustration pushing past fear. "Then unlock it." "Not yet." The two words landed softer than before, but they carried more weight, and I realized this was not about the door, not really. This was about control, about him deciding when something began and when it ended. I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even though it felt like standing too close to a fire. "Why?" I asked, and this time my voice was steadier, because if I let him see fear, I knew instinctively it would not help me. His eyes flicked briefly to the window, to the storm still raging outside, then back to me. "Because the people who follow storms like this are not the kind you want to meet alone," he said quietly, and there was something different in his tone now, something almost measured, not softer, just more deliberate. "I am not being followed," I said quickly, but even as the words left my mouth, I hesitated, replaying the last few minutes in my head, the way I had run without really thinking, the feeling that had pushed me forward even before the rain started. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You ran 3 blocks without stopping," he said, as if reading the thought straight out of my mind. "People do not do that unless they're trying to get away from something." My chest tightened. I was trying to get out of the rain. He did not argue. He did not need to. The silence stretched between us, heavier now, filled with everything I was not saying, everything he already understood. "This building is secure," he continued after a moment, his voice returning to that calm, controlled rhythm that made it impossible to interrupt. "No one enters without my permission." I glanced toward the door again, then back at him. "Except me." "Exactly." That almost sounded like approval. I frowned, confusion cutting through the tension. "So what now?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and the second it did, I saw something shift in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like I had just stepped into a line I did not know existed. "Now," he said slowly, taking another step closer, close enough that I could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the sharp clarity in his eyes. "You stay." The word echoed in my mind longer than it should have. Stay? Not wait. Not hide. Stay? Like it was a decision that had already been made. I shook my head instinctively. "I have a dorm. I have classes in the morning. I cannot just stay here." "You can," he replied, just as calmly as before, and that certainty again, it pressed against me, made it hard to breathe. "And for tonight, you will." My heart skipped, not from fear this time, but from something more complicated, something I did not want to name. "You do not even know me," I said, trying to anchor the situation in something logical, something real. "Emily Carter," he said without hesitation, and the sound of my name in his voice made everything inside me go still. "Second-year student. Architecture." My stomach dropped. "How do you know that?" I whispered, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I felt like the storm outside had followed me in, not through the door, but through him. His gaze did not waver. "Because," he said quietly, "you walked into my building." And the way he said my name again, softer this time, like it belonged in his world, made one thing painfully clear. This was not an accident. Not anymore. My name sounded different when he said it, like it had been sitting in that room long before I walked in, waiting to be used, and I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold or the storm outside. You should not know that, I said, quieter now, because something about the way he stood there made it feel pointless to raise my voice, like the room itself would not allow it. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved past me, slow and deliberate, his presence shifting the air in a way that made me turn without thinking, tracking him as he reached the desk and rested one hand lightly against its surface. There are very few things in this city I do not know, he said finally, his tone almost thoughtful, like he was explaining something simple, something obvious, and I realized then that he was not trying to impress me. He was stating a fact. I shook my head, a small, instinctive denial, because accepting that meant accepting something much bigger than I was ready for. I am just a student, I said, the words coming out faster now, as if I could shrink myself back into something invisible, something unimportant. I do not matter. His gaze lifted to mine again, sharp, focused, and for a second I wished I had said anything else. You matter because you are here, he replied, and the simplicity of it made it harder to argue. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing I could say that would undo the fact that I had walked into his world without knowing what it was. The storm outside rumbled again, lower this time, like it was moving farther away, and I realized with a sudden jolt that the building felt even quieter now, sealed off from everything beyond those walls. How long does it stay locked? I asked, forcing my voice back into something steady, something practical, because if I focused on the situation instead of him, maybe I could think clearly. Until it does not need to be, he answered, and I let out a small breath of frustration before I could stop myself. That is not an answer. A faint shift touched his expression, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something in between that made me feel like I had stepped into a conversation where I did not understand the rules. 1 hour, he said after a moment, and the precision of it caught me off guard. Every night. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the numbers glowing softly in the dim light, and tried to calculate how much longer that meant, how much time I had to stand here under his gaze, trying not to feel like I had made a mistake I could not undo. And you stay here every night? I asked, because that seemed like the only logical conclusion, even though nothing about this felt logical anymore. He considered the question briefly, then nodded once. When I need to. That answer somehow said more than if he had explained everything, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the rain still dripping from my clothes. What happens if someone tries to get in? The question slipped out before I could stop it, curiosity pushing past caution, and the second it did, I wished I could take it back. His eyes held mine for a fraction longer than before, something unreadable passing through them, something that made my stomach tighten. They do not, he said simply, and that was the end of it. No elaboration, no explanation, just certainty. I looked away first, my gaze dropping to the floor, to the faint trail of water I had left behind, and I suddenly felt out of place in a way I could not fix, like I had brought something messy into a space that was controlled down to the smallest detail. You can sit, he said after a moment, and the shift in tone caught me off guard again, softer, almost considerate, and I hesitated before moving toward one of the chairs near the window. The leather was cool beneath me, firm, expensive in a way I had only ever seen from a distance, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, unsure of where to put them, unsure of what to do with myself now that I was not trying to leave. He watched me the entire time, not in a way that felt careless or distracted, but focused, intentional, like every movement I made was something he was choosing to remember. You should not have come here tonight, he said quietly, and I let out a small, humorless breath. I already figured that out. No, he corrected, just as calmly as before, stepping closer again, closing the distance until I could feel the weight of his presence without him touching me. You have not. I looked up at him, confusion returning, sharper this time, because something in his voice told me this was not about the office, not about the storm, not about a locked door or a bad decision. What does that mean? I asked, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a pause, a real one, like he was choosing his next words carefully. It means, he said slowly, his gaze steady, unwavering, that you walked into something that does not end when the door unlocks. The room felt smaller again, the air heavier, and I realized with a sinking certainty that leaving this building might not mean leaving whatever this was. Outside, the storm was beginning to quiet, the rain softening against the glass, but inside, nothing felt calmer. If anything, it felt like everything was just beginning. His words did not fade after he said them. They stayed, lingering in the space between us, pressing against my thoughts in a way that made it hard to focus on anything else, and I found myself staring at him longer than I should have, trying to understand what he meant without asking again. "Everything ends when the door unlocks," I said finally, more to convince myself than him, my fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the chair as I held on to something simple, something logical. He did not argue. He did not correct me. He simply watched, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any response he could have given. The rain softened further against the glass, no longer pounding, just a steady rhythm now, like the storm was moving on without me, leaving me behind in a place that did not feel temporary anymore. I shifted in the chair, the damp fabric of my hoodie uncomfortable against my skin, and I became aware again of how out of place I looked, how different I was from everything in this room. He noticed that too. Of course he did. "You are cold," he said, not as a question, and before I could respond, he moved again, crossing the room with the same controlled ease, reaching a cabinet built seamlessly into the wall. He opened it, pulled out something dark, and when he turned back, I realized it was a coat. Not just any coat. Heavy, structured, expensive in a way that made it clear it had never been an afterthought. He held it out toward me. I hesitated. Everything about this situation told me I should not accept anything from him, should not make this more real than it already was. But the cold had settled deep into my bones, and the warmth of the room was not enough to chase it away. Slowly, carefully, I stood and stepped closer, taking the coat from his hands without letting my fingers touch his. The fabric was soft, warm, immediately different from anything I owned, and for a second, I just stood there holding it, unsure what to do next. "Put it on," he said quietly, and there was no pressure in his voice, no command, just expectation, like he already knew I would. I slipped it over my shoulders, the weight of it settling around me, and something about that simple action felt strangely significant, like I had crossed a line I could not see. It smelled faintly like him, something clean, subtle, and I quickly pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the warmth spreading through me. "Thank you," I said, the words coming out softer than I intended, and he gave a slight nod, as if gratitude was not something he needed but accepted anyway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence returned, but it felt different now, less sharp, more watchful. "You said people follow storms," I said after a few seconds, breaking it because I needed something to hold on to that was not the way he was looking at me. "What did you mean?" His gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, like he was deciding how much to say. "Storms create opportunity," he answered, his tone measured, careful. "Power outages, distractions, gaps in systems that are usually closed." I frowned slightly, trying to piece that together, trying to understand how that connected to me being here. "And you think someone was following me?" I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it, and this time he did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer again, just enough to narrow the space between us, his eyes scanning my face like he was looking for something I had not realized I was showing. "I think," he said slowly, "you were not paying attention to what was behind you." My stomach tightened. Images flashed through my mind, the empty street, the sound of footsteps I had ignored, the feeling that had pushed me to run faster without knowing why, and suddenly it did not feel like just the rain anymore. "I did not see anyone," I said, but my voice lacked the certainty it had before. "That does not mean no one saw you," he replied, and the quiet way he said it made it settle deeper than I wanted it to. I pulled the coat tighter around me, more for the comfort than the warmth now, and glanced toward the window again, half expecting to see something, someone, but the street below looked normal, distant, unaware. "So what happens when the door unlocks?" I asked, turning back to him, needing to know what came next, needing to understand where this ended. His gaze held mine, steady, unchanging, and for a second, I thought he might not answer again. Then he spoke. "That depends," he said, his voice lower. Now, more deliberate, on whether they are still looking. The words settled into the room, quiet but heavy, and I realized that whatever safety this place offered, it might not extend beyond these walls. And for the first time, leaving did not feel like freedom. It felt like a risk. The word risk settled deeper than I expected, heavier than fear, because fear could be ignored, pushed aside. But risk meant consequence, meant something real waiting on the other side of that door, and I felt my grip tighten on the edge of the coat as I tried to steady my thoughts. "You are assuming a lot," I said, forcing my voice to stay even though my mind was already replaying every second before I stepped into the building, searching for something I might have missed. He did not look convinced. He never looked convinced. "I am considering possibilities," he replied calmly, and the way he said it made it sound like possibilities were something he dealt with every day, something he controlled instead of feared. I exhaled slowly, glancing toward the clock again, counting the minutes without meaning to, because time suddenly felt important, like every second inside this room was shifting something I could not see. "So what do you expect me to do?" I asked, turning back to him, because standing here waiting for something unknown felt worse than asking the question directly. His gaze did not move from mine. "Nothing," he said, and that answer caught me off guard more than anything else he had said so far. "Nothing," I repeated, my brows pulling together in confusion. "You stay," he clarified, his tone steady. "You observe, and you do not leave until I tell you it is time." The words echoed faintly in my mind, not loud, not forceful, but firm enough that they felt like a boundary I was not supposed to cross. I shifted my weight slightly, the coat settling more comfortably around my shoulders, and for a second I considered arguing again, pushing back, reminding him that he had no right to decide anything for me. But something stopped me. Not fear. Not exactly. It was the realization that he was not trying to convince me. He was simply stating what would happen. And somehow that made it harder to resist. "You act like this is normal," I said quietly, watching him carefully now, trying to understand how someone could stand so still in a situation that felt so strange to me. "For me, it is," he answered without hesitation, and there was no arrogance in his voice, just truth, and that made it even more unsettling. Silence followed again, but this time it felt less like pressure and more like anticipation, like something was building beneath the surface that I could not quite reach. I moved toward the window without thinking, drawn by the faint glow of the city below, and pressed my fingers lightly against the cool glass, watching the rain taper off into scattered drops that slid down slowly, one after another. The storm was almost gone. The streets were beginning to look normal again, cars moving, lights flickering back to life in nearby buildings, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside had reset itself while I was stuck here in something that had not. "It is clearing," I said softly, more to myself than him, but he heard it anyway. "It always does," he replied, and there was something in his voice this time, something quieter, almost distant, like he was speaking from experience that went beyond just weather. I turned slightly, studying him again, noticing the way he stood near the desk, one hand resting lightly against it, completely at ease in a space that still felt foreign to me. "And when it clears, everything goes back to normal?" I asked, even though I already suspected the answer. He looked at me for a moment longer before responding. "Not everything," he said, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten again. I looked away, back to the window, because holding his gaze for too long felt like stepping too close to something I did not understand. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the glass, distorted by the last streaks of rain, the coat hanging off my shoulders, my expression caught somewhere between confusion and something deeper, something I was not ready to name. "You said 1 hour," I said after a few seconds, trying to bring the conversation back to something measurable, something I could control. "How much time is left?" I heard him move behind me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the room. 10 minutes, he answered, and the precision of it made my stomach drop slightly, because 10 minutes suddenly felt too short and too long at the same time. Too short to figure out what was happening. Too long to stand here pretending I was not affected by it. I nodded once, even though he could not see it clearly from where he stood, and focused on the city again, counting the seconds in my head without meaning to. The silence stretched, but it did not feel empty anymore. It felt charged, like something was waiting just beyond those 10 minutes, something that would change the moment the door unlocked. "When it opens," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. I am leaving. I meant it. I needed to mean it. But behind me, his response came just as calm as before, just as certain. We will see. And somehow, those 3 words made the next 10 minutes feel like the longest I had ever waited. 10 minutes should have felt manageable, something I could count down and endure. But the longer I stood there, the more those minutes stretched into something heavier, something that pressed against my chest with every second that passed. I kept my eyes on the city, watching the last traces of rain fade into a glossy sheen on the streets below, headlights reflecting off wet pavement like nothing had ever happened, like the storm had never existed at all. But inside, nothing felt normal. Inside, everything felt paused, suspended between what had already happened and what was about to. I became aware of the sound of my own breathing, steady but shallow, and the faint ticking of the clock behind me, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate, like it was counting down to something I could not see yet. You are thinking too much. His voice came from behind me, calm, almost quiet, and I did not turn right away. And you are not, I replied, my eyes still fixed on the glass, because facing him felt like stepping back into something I was not ready to handle again. I do not need to think, he said, and I could hear the subtle shift of his movement as he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the difference in the air between us. I already know what matters. I let out a small breath, something between frustration and disbelief, and finally turned to face him again. And what is that? I asked, because if he was going to speak in statements like that, I needed to understand at least part of it. His gaze met mine instantly, steady, unchanging, like he had been waiting for that exact question. Whether it is safe for you to walk out of here, he said simply, and the directness of it caught me off guard, stripping away the ambiguity from before. For a moment, I did not know how to respond. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell him he was overthinking, that this was all unnecessary, but the memory of what he had said earlier lingered, the idea that I had not been paying attention to what was behind me, and I felt that same unease return, quieter now, but more persistent. And you still think it is not? I asked, my voice softer than before, because part of me already knew the answer. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted briefly toward the door, then back to me, as if he was measuring something I could not see. I think, he said slowly, that if someone was watching you, they would not give up because of a locked door. The words settled into the room, quiet but heavy, and I felt my stomach tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that this situation might extend beyond this moment, beyond this building, into something I had not expected when I ran through the rain looking for shelter. That does not mean they are still there, I said, though the certainty I tried to put into the words did not quite hold. No, he agreed, his tone unchanged. It does not. Silence followed again, but this time it felt different, more focused, like both of us were waiting for the same thing, even if we were not saying it out loud. I glanced back at the clock, watching the seconds tick forward, each one louder than the last in my mind, until I finally spoke again. How do you decide? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now, because the question felt more important than anything else I had said so far. When it is safe. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was quieter, more deliberate than before. I do not guess, he said, and something in the way he said it made it clear that guessing was not something he allowed himself to do. I confirm. The word hung in the air, precise and controlled, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Confirm how? I asked, even though part of me was not sure I wanted to know. He did not look away. By knowing where everyone is, he replied, and the simplicity of it made it sound almost reasonable, even though I knew it was not in the world I came from, not in the life I understood. I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, anything that would make this feel less real, less certain, but there was nothing there except calm, steady control. The clock ticked again, then again, and suddenly, a soft sound broke through the silence. A faint click. It came from the door. Small, precise, but unmistakable. I turned toward it instantly, my heart jumping, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, and for a split second, everything felt suspended, like the room itself was holding its breath. It is open, I said, the words coming out quickly, almost automatically, because that was what I had been waiting for, what I had told myself I would do the moment it happened. I took a step forward. But behind me, his voice came again, calm as ever, steady, unchanged. Wait. Just one word. And somehow, it stopped me mid-step, even though I had promised myself it would not. I stopped. Not because I wanted to, not because I agreed with him, but because something in the way he said that single word settled into me before I could react, like my body understood something my mind had not caught up to yet. My hand hovered inches from the door, fingers slightly curled, ready to reach for the handle, and for a second I just stood there, caught between the instinct to leave and the weight of his voice holding me in place. "It is open," I said again, quieter this time, as if repeating it would make it more real, more certain, but I did not move any closer. Behind me, I heard him step forward, slow, measured, and the sound alone was enough to make my chest tighten. "Doors open," he said calmly. "That does not mean you should walk through them." I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding and turned slightly, just enough to see him over my shoulder. "You said I could leave," I reminded him, even though I knew he had not said it like that, not exactly, and he tilted his head just a fraction, like he was acknowledging the difference without correcting me. "I said you would leave when it was time," he replied, his tone steady, unchanged, and the certainty in it made something in my chest shift again, not fear, not exactly, but something closer to awareness. I turned back to the door, focusing on it, on the simple reality of it being unlocked, because that was something I understood, something normal. "Then how do you know it is not time?" I asked, my voice sharper now, because I needed something concrete, something I could hold on to instead of the quiet tension filling the room. He did not answer right away. Instead, I heard a faint sound behind me, something subtle, almost easy to miss if I had not been listening for anything out of place. A soft vibration. Then another. I frowned slightly and glanced back at him, but his gaze had shifted past me, focused somewhere beyond the door, like he was listening to something I could not hear. "What is that?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a slight change in his expression, not uncertainty, not concern, but attention, sharper now, more precise. He did not answer me directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a phone, the screen lighting up briefly against the dim room, and his eyes flicked across it quickly, processing whatever information appeared there with a speed that made it clear this was not new to him. "Stay here," he said quietly, and the shift in his tone made my stomach drop, because this time it was not just calm control. There was something else beneath it, something focused, intentional. "What is going on?" I asked, stepping back from the door without realizing it, the instinct to leave suddenly clashing with the uncertainty of what might be waiting on the other side. He did not look at me when he answered. "Someone is still outside," he said, his voice low, controlled, like he was stating a fact he had already confirmed, and the words landed harder than anything else he had said so far. My heart skipped, then started again, faster this time, the earlier unease rising back to the surface, stronger now that it had something real to attach to. "You are sure?" I asked, even though the way he spoke made it clear he did not deal in guesses. He glanced at me briefly then, just long enough for me to see the certainty in his eyes. "I do not say things I am not sure about," he replied, and the simplicity of it left no room for doubt. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against the sleeve of the coat, suddenly more aware of the space around me, the quiet hallway beyond that door, the unknown that waited just out of sight. "Then why open it?" I asked, the question coming out faster than I intended, because if he knew someone was still there, why let the door unlock at all? His gaze shifted back to the door, then to me again, and for a second, there was something almost unreadable in his expression, something that felt like calculation. "Because now," he said slowly, "we can see who is waiting." The words settled into the room, heavy and deliberate, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the storm that had already passed. My eyes flicked back to the door, half expecting it to move, to open on its own, but it remained still, silent, like it was waiting for one of us to make the next move. "I am not part of whatever this is," I said quietly, more to myself than him, because the situation felt like it was shifting into something I did not understand, something I had not agreed to be part of. "You are here," he replied, just as calmly as before, And that same simple logic again, impossible to argue with in the moment. I shook my head, slightly, taking another step back, putting distance between myself and the door, even though a few seconds ago that door had been the only thing I wanted to reach. I just needed somewhere to wait out the storm, I said, my voice softer now, almost lost under the weight of everything else. And now you are waiting out something else, he answered, and there was something in his tone this time, something quieter, almost like acknowledgement. The silence returned, thicker now, more charged, and I found myself watching the door without meaning to, my body tense, my thoughts racing, trying to understand what was happening outside that I could not see. Seconds passed. Then another faint sound echoed from the hallway, softer than before, but unmistakable now that I was listening for it. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to tell me that he was right. Someone was there. And suddenly, the idea of stepping through that door did not feel like escape anymore. It felt like stepping into something I was not prepared to face. The silence after that sound felt different, sharper, like the room itself had shifted its attention toward the door, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, my body instinctively trying to become quieter, smaller, as if that would somehow make me less noticeable to whatever was on the other side. I did not move. I did not speak. I just listened. Another faint sound followed, softer this time, like a step carefully placed, controlled, deliberate, and my stomach tightened as the reality of it settled in. This was not random. This was not someone passing by. This was someone waiting. They are not leaving, I whispered, the words barely audible, but he heard them anyway. No, he replied calmly, and the certainty in his voice made it clear he had already come to that conclusion long before I had. I glanced at him, searching his expression for something, anything that might tell me what to do next, but he looked exactly the same as before. Controlled, focused, unmoved. Like this was a situation he had already anticipated. What do we do? I asked, and the question came out more honest than I intended, because for the first time since I had walked into that office, I was not trying to leave. I was trying to understand how to stay safe. His gaze shifted briefly toward me, and there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not softer, not warmer, just more certain. You stay behind me, he said, his tone quiet but firm, and without waiting for a response, he stepped forward, positioning himself between me and the door with a smooth, deliberate motion that felt almost instinctive. I hesitated for half a second, then moved as he said, not because I trusted him completely, but because in that moment, he was the only person in the room who seemed to know exactly what was happening. The coat felt heavier around my shoulders now, like it carried more than just warmth, and I pulled it tighter as I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the door. The handle did not move. The hallway beyond remained unseen. But the presence on the other side felt closer now, more real, like a shadow pressing against the boundary between inside and out. Are they trying to get in? I asked quietly, my voice steady despite the tension building in my chest, and he shook his head slightly. No, he said, they are waiting for you to come out. The words landed harder than I expected, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the air in the room. Why me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because nothing about this made sense, not to me, not to the life I knew before tonight. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached toward the desk, pressing something out of sight, and I heard a faint shift in the building itself, subtle but unmistakable, like something had just been activated. Then he looked back at me. That is what I intend to find out, he said, and the calm determination in his voice made it clear this was not a question he would leave unanswered. I swallowed, my thoughts racing, trying to piece together anything that could explain this, anything that could make sense of why someone would be waiting outside a door for me. But there was nothing. Just confusion. Just the growing realization that this night was not going to end the way it started. Maybe. They have the wrong person, I said quickly, grasping for something. Anything that would make this less personal, less real. Maybe, he agreed. But the way he said it made it sound unlikely, like a possibility he had already considered and dismissed. The silence stretched again, heavier now, more focused, and I found myself watching him instead of the door, noticing the way he stood, completely still but fully aware, like every part of him was tuned to what was happening beyond that wall. You are not scared, I said quietly, and it was not a question. It was an observation. He glanced at me briefly, and for a second, there was something almost unreadable in his eyes, something that made me realize fear might not be something he allowed himself to feel the same way I did. Fear is only useful when it changes your outcome, he said, and the calm logic of it made my chest tighten again, because right now, I had no idea what outcome I was facing. Another second passed, then another, and suddenly, the faintest sound came again, closer this time, right outside the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to confirm what we already knew. Someone was there, waiting, watching, and for the first time since I stepped into that office, I understood something clearly. Leaving was not the end of this. It was the beginning. The sound outside the door did not get louder, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant whoever was there did not need to rush, did not need to force anything. They were patient, controlled, waiting in a way that felt intentional, and I realized my hands had tightened into fists without me noticing, the fabric of the coat pressing into my fingers as I tried to steady my breathing. I stayed where I was, just behind him, close enough to feel the stillness in his posture, the complete absence of hesitation, and for a moment I wondered what it must feel like to stand there without doubt, without the constant question of what might happen next. "They know I am here," I said quietly, because there was no other explanation that made sense anymore, and the moment the words left my mouth, they felt real in a way I could not take back. He did not turn, but I saw the slight shift in his shoulders, the acknowledgement of what I had just said. "Yes," he replied, just as calmly as before, and the confirmation made something settle inside me. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. "Then they are not leaving," I continued, my voice steadier now, because if I accepted that part, the rest began to fall into place in a way that was almost logical. "No," he said again, and the repetition did not feel redundant, it felt final. I swallowed, forcing myself to think, to stay grounded in something real, something I could control, even if it was just my next question. "So what happens now?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to move, waiting for something to break the stillness that had taken over everything. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, just one step, closing the last bit of distance between himself and the door, his presence filling the space in a way that made it clear he was not reacting anymore. He was deciding. "Now," he said slowly, his voice lower, more deliberate than before, "we changed the outcome." The words settled into the room, quiet but certain, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever happened next was not going to be random, not going to be left to chance. He reached toward the door, not opening it, not touching the handle, but hovering there for a second like he was listening, like he was measuring something I could not hear, and I held my breath again without meaning to. Every part of me focused on that single moment. Then he stepped back. Not away, just enough. "They expect you," he said, turning slightly toward me now, his gaze locking onto mine with a precision that made it impossible to look away. Not me. The meaning hit instantly, sharp and clear, and I felt a flicker of resistance rise before I could stop it. "I am not going out there," I said quickly, the words coming out stronger than I felt, because the idea alone made my chest tighten again. He did not argue. He did not push. He simply studied me for a second longer, and then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like he had already anticipated that. Response: "You are not," he agreed, and the calm acceptance of it caught me off guard. "Then what do you mean?" I asked, confusion cutting through the tension, because if I was not going out there, then what was he planning? His gaze flicked briefly toward the door, then back to me, and for a moment, there was something almost unreadable in his expression, something that felt like strategy more than reaction. "It means," he said slowly, "they will not get what they came for." The certainty in his voice settled into me, grounding me in a way I did not expect, and I realized I was watching him differently now, not just as the man who had kept me here, but as the only person in this moment who seemed to understand the situation completely. "And that changes everything," he added quietly, and the weight of those words made the silence that followed feel heavier, more charged. Another second passed, then another, and then, finally, the handle on the door moved. Not forcefully, not abruptly, just a slow, deliberate turn, like whoever was on the other side had decided it was time. My breath caught, my body tensing instinctively, and I felt the space behind me suddenly feel too small, too close, as the line between inside and outside began to blur. The door opened just an inch, then two, enough to break the seal, enough to let the outside in without fully revealing what waited beyond. I did not move. I could not. Every instinct told me to step back, to put distance between myself and that opening. But something held me in place, something stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. Beside me, he did not step away. He did not hesitate. He simply shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between me and the door once again. And in that moment, I understood something I had not realized before. This was not about keeping me inside anymore. This was about making sure nothing from the outside reached me. The door remained partially open, silent, waiting, and I felt my heartbeat steady in a way that surprised me. Because for the first time since this night began, I was not thinking about leaving. I was thinking about what came next. And behind that door, something had just realized it was not getting what it expected.